Popular Literature 1 ki Unit 1 ki topic Children's Literature and Introduction to Tenga Tori Vaniko. Ona Nasiki topic say Quiki Children's Literature ki Quiki opening habitatiko Quiki lecture Mari Igami or Sina Hanbo Dunya Children's Literature have a Sikarino Karibu Kawi ko the Mogi development throughout history habitatiko history Quiki Kamina Mo developed or Kibano Mogi relevance Karino Mogi importance Karino Mayam Dokanasi Tenga Tori. So, the topic say BEGC 106 Popular Literature, Block 2 Genres of Popular Literature 1, Unit 1 Children's Literature and Introduction. How does it call it? Objectives. Broad understanding of what constitutes children's literature, beginning with books that we introduce young children to, right up to the point where they enter their teens and become young adults and grow beyond to enter adulthood. Or na ahan bada pina angang singda. Children's literature is book kari kawi. Mo angang masa singda pina karamba lirik habitatare ne ko literature habitatare. Exposed to hawi aduga moina angang or badagi moina teenagers or ba audagi kona young adults or ba masida moina adugi adu matutna mo adult or no ko young adult tagi matanga auna moigi kari habitatare children's literature kari karamba lirik bu children's literature singe habit ne pina do turism aduga ani subuda understanding concepts that are used in analyzing children's literature on the concepts karako kuina children ki literature analyze to kan the scene of concepts karato kuina ne hom bakatai also the understanding of various concepts such as ideology what childhood and adolescence are habadi childhood habsna karino adolescence habsna karino notion of gender habji matra social construct amani hai ko gender karino habdi among other aspects so finally idea of where children's literature may be located in entire process of socialization of children and adolescents. On ngasi ge point na topics kay yami ko. On ahan bada objectives sing se broad understanding of what constitutes children's literature. Ko kari nabu children's literature sage ha kari yauke ha. Beginning with books that we introduce young children to angang sing da oina utpa khanganba ko pahanba right up to the point where they enter their teens ko teenager ko 13 14 ko 15 almel and become young adults are going to do tarakpa finally and grow beyond to enter adulthood or moigi stages sing the children ki stage apoina moida pahanba uhanba khanganba lyric sing du ta ani suda understanding concepts that are used in analyzing children's literature on kari concepts sing na sinaraga apoina children's literature bu analyze to ke have to yengadori ne ahum suda understanding of various concepts such as ideology ko wakalon ko what childhood and adolescence are childhood have na karino adolescence have na karino notion of gender have na karino among other aspects mi am to put in the ko si introduction gi or introductory ahanba lectures da atuko finally idea of where children's literature may be located in entire process of socialization of children and adolescents on children's literature je kadai ta yawba apina kadai ta locate to bun ge atuko on angang sing children namasung adolescents singi socialization da children's literature je kadai da point ubo phange kadai da poina hapa yake habne na gadursh introduction we recall how we have heard stories as children be they fables or storybook fable are the equiki Aesop's fable kan no taramani ko ai taramani na lore wari sing da equiki moral story me oba animal sing je equiki human like qualities ka sel la ko moral story ma ko ta ko du fable ko bi ko matam given that storytelling is an integral part of our living culture on a very liba habase culture kudi mo we oral tradition no lo itong label na every culture every group of people have a on every tribe every nation every whatever maybe why liba ki culture amma se dum there but ko throughout history ko integral na it is natural that writing for children should actually grow and develop into an academic field na angang sing gi damakta angang sing the target to ba writing sing je academic film oina naingarak pa hai the same how san have auna angang oing da pina example in have the hare and the tortoise have a very fable amani adu example amka madum wari se paraga tamaga auna wari liba wari ta ba hai the culture ku especially our own culture ko yamna relevant oiba amasung yamna kan integral go part of oibanina akoina angang sing the bakta iba wari sing have tare literature have tare moi sing se when analyze tawraga academic field am oina onthorak ba hai se mahausa ne have yandare This course is on popular literature, but through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll has been prescribed as part of syllabus and is classified as a children's storybook. Hence, the need for us to look at what children's literature is and decide whether or not Through the Looking Glass is part of children's literature. On children's literature, Through the Looking Glass, by Lewis Carroll, what is it called? And novel was I have a She's a syllabus key part of prescribed away, a children's storybook in the classified away. Through the Looking Glass, Masiki stories there, Queen of Children's Literature in Kobe Agatra, Yarodra Habato Quina, Saitobodorium, Magi, parameters current satisfied over children's literature or the curricular parameters satisfied to equally have the Yanga through the Looking Glass over the right of winning decide over the ribbon of Popon. Defining children's literature. We define it as writing that have been written and developed to entertain and instruct youngsters. Children's literature can define writing makalamani, karigitamoto iriba, karigitamoto develop toriba hypokanda, Naha Singbu, Angang Singbu, Moibu Nuainaba, Moibu entertain Tonabi Irapato, Madupina, children's literature cover. Children's literature would encompass heavily Karika Yaugani Habakanda, a wide range of works, Karikari Makandi works in Yaugin such as good old classics, pictorial storybooks, comics, graphic novels, folk tales, fairy tales, lullabies, as well as orally narrated folk tales, folk songs, and legends. Oh, now, children's literature category is a matic chow crop ama oibenina kari yauge have kanda classics you like sing the children's literature they on bi pictorial storybooks comics graphic novels folk tales ko ngawari ka have to fairy tales Cinderella ga haikatra the Rapunzel Sleeping Beauty ko mayam to lullabies have ang theme bagi as well as orally narrated folk tales, folk songs, legends. Legends are the Kamba to be legend guide epic. Literature form the logos. Some define children's literature as books written for children. Some leave out comics, cartoon illustrated books, and other non-fiction such as autobiographies. On the Karana comics cartoon illustrated books kumba kai kumba children's literature chande kote kind of claim to webo have the sections of critics have tare na ko mogi experts in ko kara na yai kara ya de kara accept to it may be useful for us to take into account that we need to realize that genre of children's literature is broad with blurry boundaries ona akoina ningsang ga do se kari no have kanda genre of children's literature ja to kimatik pa chawi ko duga maje siju acceptable oi siju oi ka have to yamna blurry oi my boundaries yamna my demarcation hargen ko my borders yamna blurry oi na siju acceptable na siju acceptable oi na children in the pa da yaina ko na have to ko when agree to na ko na hargati children's literature ki borders yamna rigid oi te yamna blurry oi aduna like makan comic po ero graphic novels ero folk tales or fairy tales or lullabies or classics or pictorial storybooks or may have the loin among children literature ni and up in OBI analyze OBI. Victorian society tried to influence its children through medium of stories that were moralistic and didactic. On a Victorian society, Queen Victoria gi matamgi society na ko Satra Singda or Angang Singda Harage, Satra Harage, children have been Angang Singda stories kara Taga, Liraga, Moida moral lesson, Amayaba, Amazon didactic or didactic Haragati, Wiki, Genoma Tak Pokemon, have a typos, Ozanaga, lecture people didactic way, had to the Kenoma Kanom, the Bakanoma learned on the Bukatuna. Victorian society the Satra Singze, or excuse me, Satra Harage, Angang Singze. Moral amasung didactic stories mayam libiraga moigi character have a du influence these stories had a preaching tone preach story mong do have the sermon no pangthokpa moi de kedoma khangjalu heichalu chi smai to have mong do teaching right values to youngsters while encouraging social conformity and compliance. Sina apabani society da ko ang nupa mo oragadi na nupa masam oragadi sumaya tawdabuni si tawdabuni nupi masam organ sumaya tawdabuni have adugumba rules kumba ko right values kumba kai matapi ba ang singda aduga social conformity at society amada belong to haragadi masi sana visi follow tawdabuni ko kadamni du conformity ko ko compliance agan aya ba ko aduna mo zero nama nupi masai di example in higher ko Victorian society ki nupi masai di yamna loud oidabni yamna feminine oidabni example na hamda audidi moje yamna gentle oidabni kana ka tapiba pamasa singsina mo brave oidabni chivalrous oidabni ka yamna sacrifice ka tobong oidabni kana takda atu myamdo agang singda Victorian age ki ngang singda moiki wari singduna moida tapi amusung tapi. Children's literature, in a sense, uses make-believe. Make-believe actually sajan ba ko, I believe real with the fantasy as opposed to reality. On fantasy, I'm yaw with the ko. I believe more the example in the harabada, angang gilarik sing the magic kumba, I believe ko magic kumba, science fiction kumba kay kumba yang. Hay angang sing na paning na ba angang sing na kahani palm na ba I believe ko. Matumi ang do na children's literature the yang do na uba pangyan. Fantasy was considered non-serious and best suited for children's literature. No matam hujing matam da budi high fantasy, dark fantasy kind of makan fantasy, low fantasy example in harab ko makan yamna leire adubu matam du da di fantasy je yamna serious oidaba genre ama ko literature ki genre amani kind of khanarami adu angang sing do sana ba ko habadi an sing ka papam thokta angang sing ba ga dom ne kind khalaga fantasy je ayamba children's literature da focus torme ko madu. Fantasy was seen as frivolous and deemed unworthy of critical attention. Now, fantasy ki wari gumba, fantasy ki novel gumba, anything called fantasy ki work, hai talega. Moje yamna frivolous oi, hai bati yamna light-hearted oi koli ko. Now, critical attention gumba pi bata matik chade, hai bati wakalo nama believe hum nere meba. Ujikti fantasy bo robo high fantasy, low fantasy gumba da bigi research to ba kotpa critical analysis to buje yamna common oi ko. But matam du di children's literature fantasy am yawi, kari no hai pakanda. Fantasy ji matam da yamna unserious oiba yamna uncritical oiba genre amani category amni thajanarameba madumi. A brief history of children's literature ko brief history mi yingji. Children's literature began with oral storytelling being passed down from one generation to another ko amatagi amata adi why is have say ana iba ko khotpa habigi concept la chini da why is mi amana mi amda lead in da ko akoi ki when we were children I got angang wini da akoi ki hai tare ko punga wari ga have culture to project pudi like that because sujikti akoi ki kitchen daga punga ama ukot daga chak ngai boina mai ba na sa ka thong ngai boina angang sing da mabok ki manak da question laga phamaka mabong na wari li bagi culture je sunglei leitre abu bi ai ko maybe countryside room da kitang haidaba jaga da kitang leram gadra but akoi ki urban areas in the they have a tare aduguma punga gumagi mapum ju space leitre as well as adigi chapna bi jutam na tapna mangjale have a tare ko aduna makha tam sa thara trum ko maybe rural areas kumba da dikra leram gini have gi taza ka dile matumit ona mugi oral storytelling je matang ko generation amadagi generation amada pari jili thara angang sing je nokshinadaba angang sing ki hannaba angang sing no hannaba anything ko I pati koi manipuri da haragana children's story ga haraga children's story muti horror story ne have jai ko we like sang bi natra atu kai bu kai ba kai ja koi angang sing je behave to na ba ko na ba hai tare ko adu hanga wai si matam tum bi thara ko do chikna mu record to ro ko sun ba ko sun bi to ani but matam du da di koi ki horror phon hai tare ko madu da di koi oral tradition da na la pu na to ne ko ai na mi ma da wai li rani mi da mo to ba da li ne matam ko aduna accurate by story when by ba se khara wai madu it Panchatantra composed around 200 BC, while Aesop's fables composed between 620 and 564 BC. Panchatantra jina koi India ki version in Lord's ko ki Amar Chitra Kathana ga yamna ko wari je ko noi wari mi yaw ko madu da koi moral lessons kum ga yaw ba angang sing na pa di thalai ga da comic mong da same group ni ko wari sing yamna nuksi ba yamna didactic oi ba hair ko ki term do sinara ke wari me hoy aduga Aesop ki fables sinjuna mo 620 dagina 564 BC da collect to body masina ha ba animals sing the human like qualities chelalaga moida koi ki waridu para matungda waridu tar matungda bigi angang singda moral lesson ama tapi bada ba matu SOS Fable gi aim ne matungda. Globally, folk tales and fables were used as a means to instruct and were oral in tradition. Oh no, globally, anywhere yenguba kanda koina folk tales amasung fables in the Panchachandra na folk tale mun helorj ka atuga SOS Fables in maming dum yausare ko fable nga kani moise angang sing da tapi na ba sumai taw si taw no si phate ko te ka have the wari gi mo have tare ko instead of koina sumai taw no si taw ko lo ne dare having mota wari amagi mo da ta ka ti angang sing da ne henna lopsan ba amasung ningsing ba to kuina satpani na wari mo da li ba ho ne ko atuga moise oral in tradition harakati ithok aga wari do pahan bagi sana bi kuidri ko ayambana ngang sing do wari gi mo da li ra ga haitar ko phamin naraga wari sadara ga wari li ra ga koi oral tradition gi mo da Panchachandra gumba SOS Fable gumba je pass down torokane ko throughout the whole world hairage. In medieval Europe, there was little by way of entertainment factor in children's literature. Medieval Europe adi 1300s, 1400s, 1500s ko tu da ko entertainment factor children's literature da kya yaude. In 15th century, textbooks began to emerge that could be said to have been meant for children. Now, 15th century adai dang da ne ko ngang sing gi da ngang sing da focus to ba angang sing da aim to ba lyric sing pong ba hor krisi and like adu ma di leram debo adu ma da angang gi lyric or angang na pa na lyric ka have say adu concept to exist torom debo because maram mudiam ya me ko maram ma ara na ai ki common people I am basing je printing press laga zu ai ki angang sing gi da ma di effort to ngam da ba angang sing gi have di maru oi na khanaram da sam har to ko adu na ko na 15th century matung da gi na lai lo ko adu ma da di leiragazu kuigi angang gi tamakta angang da focus to ba angang da aim to ba lai kum se I ba have se yam tangna or almost non existent in the way. It was a world where it was unknown for adults to be writing for children adu ne ba na ahan singjina angang da focus to ga angang da duai na ba angang ne enjoy to ba wari I ba lari I ba have se adu gi concept leram de ni ma hading je ko no real distinctions were made between two readerships. Earlier books written for children were biblical tales and fairy tales. On the Paidaki, Liraba, Angang the Ibiramba like sings or Wari sings Bible, the Yellow Talk about biblical tales, the Bible that we and that the religious connotation of the Yornica religion, Matang the Alba, Amazon fairy tales in the Nepal, wiki, the Grimm brothers kind of Yorkinico, Madazupa, PMC, slide with something like the when the collector Ramba, when in the Wari sing Europe, the Yana, the Loyal. But wiki Greece kumbada ko SO has a Greece ni ko the India gumbada di pengang gi wari gumba kai kumba folktale gumba se 200 BC ko 620s 564 BC da gi dum leir pa hore ko atubu medieval Europe di thing lai haven't. In 16th century In 16th century, alphabet books began to emerge from Russia, Italy, Denmark. And the alphabet books are announcing the college. Okay, haragana A, B, C, D, Coke, some line with them. Dugumba like Sibu, Aquina alphabet books going. My talk about Russia, Italy, and some Denmark, countries in the Gotamtana. Illustrated chapbooks became into existence, and these chapbooks dealt with folk tales, legends of biblical stories, and were meant for children. On a lie, Payauba, announcing the palm no. I believe words sung where the announcing the crab boring to be I copying the would be a copy and a moina illustration will be out by but lie have a tarago absent boson but like a home aduna announcing the panning the announcing the instruct on the announcing and wise and a vine like since life. Children as young as 6 years were apprenticed to artisans. Towards the end of Middle Ages, academic skills became important. I think among the day announcing Sahi Taruk Adai Hor Gai Tarako, was a apprentice when apprentice are the craft Amada, have the tongue Savoero, leather heat pot Savoero, anything called pottery or Atugumbata, Langsina, master Makata Tamaka, Moina Moheonaba, when Matangi generation, the Shem of apprenticeship Kumbakoi Katumata, although I am the story. Adubu, towards the end of Middle Ages, academic skills became important. Aduna Adimama, the like the Mokobi concept, apprenticeship in a focus of the Kutsa Hehuba, that I got with vocational training, or the Lamba, Adubu, middle ages loirapdadi akhoi academic skills in maru oi haina angang sing da ju education guma kai provide to bahore. This led to shift in thinking of children as miniature adults. So now we angang wina wakan honge ko kai da mo kya ba kan da angang sing se miniature adults haina khalam ba da wakan honge. The thinking that went behind raising children now was that children were children. Now na hojikti hana di moina angang sing se mi machani na khalam ba da mai khandre angang haiste angang na khan ba le and needed to be educated on moi like tam han ba kulan ba mathok tai dakar oi, thereby bringing in concept of child development and child psychology and children's literature. Na angang haiside angang ni moi ga han de khenai ko moi se ahan da science people na te have wakal to horo badagi di child development gi matang da no wakalon puthok hore, child psychology gi matang da no discoveries lai amasung children's literature ju form hore. Ona matam amada hana leram tabdo tamna lakpa hore ko kadai de hori have kanda 16th century, the alphabet books began to emerge from Russia, Italy, Denmark, the Tolpa Hore, but the Matunda Angang Sing Hanadi, Sahi Tarukare Surapada, apprenticeship Kimo Tarambado, education Maru Oi, have the academic skills Maru in the Kalapadagi, Angang Sing, Ahan Matani, the Kandavida, Angang Ni, the Kalaka, Angang Sing to priority Piraga, Mogi Matang, the Mogi development gi, like Iba Hore, Mogi literature gi, children's literature, children's psychology, Masum. Children's development gi matang da masi area ahum jida haiba tare ko cho ba advancement me amma pina phangya. In 1643, a collection of folk tales from all over Europe was brought out by Italian poet Giambattista Basile, Pentameron, or Tale of Tales, containing the earliest known versions of both Cinderella and Rapunzel. These two fairy tales, it must be noted, have survived test of time and thrived with Disney princess movies. So now, 1643, the folk tales man collection of Italian poet Giambattista Basile has a Pentameron has magi Tale of Tales hay balari ka ko ongba hore mon ko kanjita kari yauge haba kanda Cinderella ka Rapunzel hay ba yamna famous ba yamna common no ko yamna maming chat jo harage ne ko kuki fairy tale ni tugi earliest version do yawe ko ona koina khanga da omna huji phawda Cinderella amasung Rapunzel se huji phawda Disney movies ka do da akhoi ki nandana ko na yamna relevant oi happening da ko 1643 da Fongraba folk tale fairy tale haitaren ko sidana fairy tale harage Giambattista Basile na fongiba kuki fairy tale do project 2025 ta bokto amna relevant ori Rapunzel ko Cinderella gumbagi movie number ko bi pawdum taiba. In 1697, Charles Perrault published a book of fairy tales, and though he did not garner as much popularity as Giambattista Basile, he served a different purpose. He is said to have been the inspiration behind the work of the Grimm brothers. Now, 1697 na Charles Perrault has in a among of fairy tales. He got to Bumadi, Giambattista Basile guitar to the Maming Chapati Pankitra to Majo, a Chobat Udang, Malogi Boko, Karia Chobat Udang, Wiki, Charles Perrault, Logi Hapakanda, Mana. Inspired to the Grimm brothers hari ba paidagi popular with bahai type of fairy tales collection mape mada machimano brother ni ko Grimm brothers mo na collect ki bata ma quite popular hoy mabani bu masigi Charles Perrault hari ba paduna inspired to win love. In Puritan England, John Cotton wrote a book for children called Spiritual Milk for Boston Babes, and appeared in England. So, my like to John Cotton. This book dealt with important questions and answers about correct way of living so as to be a good Christian. On a good Christian, important questions are we answer jawi ko. Do not correct way of living. Have this mind hing the topuni, mind of conscious, mind laying the topuni ko. Christian of our moy haragadi adugi like the John Cotton jina have in the past Spiritual Milk for Boston Babes have like John Amos Comenius published the Orbis Pictus or the Visible World in Pictures, considered to be the first picture book written for children. Aduga John Amos Comenius have in the past the Orbis Pictus have like or in the Visible World in Pictures I see the Ayek Palaya considered to be the first picture book written for children. Angang sing the focus of angang sing the paningnaba yengingnaba like picture book ma ibdo kanani han ibna bo khanda John Amos Comenius have pajina ko Orbis Pictus have natraga the visible world in pictures have a hongi bane or e bane ye ki bane hai. John Bunyan was another Puritan who wrote Pilgrim's Progress, which may be described as a vision of what could be considered a good Christian's pilgrimage through life. And John Bunyan among Pilgrim's Progress ire on a dugi warida karida based on Harakanda Christian namagi pilgrimage like or much Bible type magi renounce or life from the through life. Christian namo oragadi punchigi lambi type the journey through life se kamina sikatobono that we vision the kamina we have in Matanga John Bunyan Pilgrim's Progress even. This book is known to be the most famous Christian allegory still in print. Hojipota print tawri ko John Bunyan gi Pilgrim's Progress hojipota relevant ori hojipota miyamna panari hai. Children's literature in 16th and 17th centuries. James Janeway's A Token for Children, touted as children's book about Christianity, leading good Christian life, and was about joyful death of young Christian children. Ona James Janeway gi like A Token for Children na ki Christianity matam yam pusalaga ko angang singi life pudi lai oiba ko na Christian puchi ama kamai hingani ko kani a good Christian life ama kamai hingani ka habit tapiyo. In 17th century, theme of books meant for children, educational, informative, and didactic with moral, religious, and social messages. On the 17th century, to the angang singine na pongba direct singko moi books singse educational or informative, amasung didactic or aduka moral, religious, amasung social messages miyamong jiyawe. Since it was Puritan England, Puritan age in England, puritanical beliefs find their ways into books. On the Puritan age and Puritan beliefs into like Pongbada, like Nambada, Habada, like Ibada, to more Puritan beliefs in the Europataba, some house handicap. Puritans were of the belief that God had a special covenant with them and that they had to lead their lives according to the Bible. On the Puritans in the Moiga Tazaniko, so God had a special covenant with them. Agreement having Moiko. Ishorga Moigi Marata, to give Achet Patazanabam like Atuka, Moise, Moin Punchise, Bible the Tamba, Bible teachings to give Matung in Namado, follow Torah, they have Puritans in the Tazim. They had rigid laws and were patriarchal in nature. Yana rigid oiko. CIC, they have a given distinction. Atkimatic Mayamalay Akano Amleko. Moinaga example in Harvard, Puritan law, follow to the Imungi, our Gadi, Moigi community, the Gitatopa, exile toba, panistopa, Puba, Chaiba, jail Tampa have a say Antina Kamanoevo. Auna Moise patriarchal joy have the Nupana, head of the family, head of the society over gates and the Vidulay. They banned smoking in public. Marked smoke over thingy, drinking alcohol, you took thingy, fancy clothing got Piran, Piron, Kubanan, thingy. The parents could not miss Sunday service or celebrate Christmas. On a more Sunday service to miss Tobiate, every Sunday morning service, Yaw the compulsory, Aduga Christmas celebrate Tobiate. They were orthodox in beliefs. An orthodox hierarchy, equity text, the holy text from the holy books, but the Aramba rules into exactly follow orthodox. They felt strongly about religious beliefs that they did not hesitate to permit civic authorities to enforce allegiance and compliance with their faith in an attempt to save souls of sinners. And my religious belief in the compromise of the 100% belief that we have a compromise of the party, but sinners most of literature of period consisted of sermons, poems, letters, or historical narratives, and this existed for sole purpose of sharing their value system, faith, Bible, and importance of God. On the matamdugi puritanical Puritan period, the literature singje literature to kari na literature oigi have a sermons ko have the religious teachings kumba, poems kumba, letters, or historical narratives kumba. Aduga moina mai mathal kai pangtuina kanda moigi value system ko puritanical value system to spread of no faith has Bible and importance of God to them. The belief was propagated through lesson books that were primarily written in belief that children had the potential to be evil and hence needed to be shown correct part of Bible, God, and Puritan faith. Auna angangi direction dokari ki concept the thazaragi irapodong haibakanda mogi lesson books se ko angang singju evil lobagi potential yawi auna evil logo potential du gi kannaba moita achumba labi upinaba ko Bible na only Basuma Lambi the Moy Polo Tonaba, Shorgi, the Polo Tonaba, Amasu Puritan faith to support of Naba and Kalada, Mogi children's literature single, Atuki Monda, to in a basis orega, yamna hongi amasung yamna iye ko children's literature ja ayambana religious oy ko Bible the based tawi didactic oy or as sermons kuma kai kuma matang na yam oy. Political changes came about with beheading of Charles I, creation of Commonwealth, and restoration when monarchy was restored. Na monarchy halakpatagidi hai tare ko. We ningtong halakpatagidi. Commonwealth matamdu loidra hai ko. Political changes में हम लाया Charles I behead tore ka hat ko. Creation of Commonwealth and restoration. Restoration ka restore ina kanda monarchy restore to ko. Ningtong amuk halakpa jabu restoration ka ko. The strict puritanical ideas gave way to more enlightened ideas in art, literature, culture, and the way children came to be perceived and understood. Oh, no. Hana yamna strict oiramba. Yamna puritanical oiba haibadi Bible the focus toba ko. Atopada kya focus toba Bible is I think important oi Bible is na akwiki way of life amo ni tomni Bible yawi college kai khanaramba to mato amu nangre aduga enlightened ideas in art, literature, culture ko mai myam haibadi another wakalun among Akba Horeba, enlightened wakalun, having the Chocolate Paharagan, art, kumba, literature, culture, and Locke's concept of tabula rasa, or thinking that children are born without any preconceived notion, have the blank slate, having the tabula rasa, is a young hang, but came the outriman in the Tazabot announcing. Mark notable way in which people came to understand children of not Locke concepts, except of the Gidi, announcing the understand of the Hana, announcing understand Toromai Monduga, another wakalun. Stories with moral lessons, fables, rhymes, and games began to find a place in books for children. What is moral lessons? Fable and fable, rhymes and games. Hanati Bible the Gungni Maru Bible the Odum Tamgatobani, Bible the Odum Palatobani, Kogatobani, puritanical beliefs and support of them in the Kanaramata, was it to Wakando Tadoga, moral lessons, stories, fables, rhymes, Robinson Crusoe and Gulliver's Travels, originally meant for adult readership, came to be adapted for children. And Robinson Crusoe kaya nung ayoko Daniel Defoe niba Gulliver's Travels ko Jonathan Swift mo ko. Ahan sing na pagato guni ahan sing na magtan irambato angang sing ki children literature ontropy yare ko. Have the worry sing je simple oiba follow to ng mo worry miyang ko ni na ko. Ano na mo gi worry sing je ko ki rhymes yaure moral lessons yaure fables yaure ko ano na hana Bible the ki worry Bible the inspired to worry mo kay kumbato madu utang kuitre. Children's literature in 18th and 19th centuries. In 1720s and 30s, London publishers began publishing books for entertainment of young readers. Thomas Borman was one of the earliest to dabble with writing for children. His description of 300 animals and illustrated history of London's landmarks known as the Gigantic Histories were two books published. Now, 1720s and 30s, the London publishers moina publish over hore angang sing na paning na ba angang sing enjoy to na kon na balai kara ko. Thomas Borman ja one of the earliest name ko. May angang sing matang da angang na paning na ba iba marakta Thomas Borman paitigi angan ba hai tare ko angan ba mo marka man. Mary Cooper was well known for her contribution to nursery rhymes called nursery rhymes ang sing baba ko baba black sheep na tra du me am rhyme le ko Mary had a little lamb kind of map ko. Her Tommy Thumb's Pretty Songbook volumes 1 and 2 are the first known nursery rhyme collections ko magi like ko Tommy Thumb's Pretty Songbook volumes 1 and 2 na akoi ki nursery rhymes ki marak ta ko ai ki ihan han ba ai ki li ra ba hai ba tare ko collection ne. Her collection has versions of Baba Black Sheep and Hickory Dickory Dock Hickory Dickory Clock London Bridge is Falling Down Yawi Amasung Sing a Song of Sixpence. Simiam the Queen Angang Yam Oiding it, Queen Nursery rhyme, sing the nursery, Tambakan had kindergarten, nursery to go, Tamakraba, Tinagraba, English Tambakan to go, Tinagraba rhymes company, Masimiamze, Mary Cooperna, Makilari, Tommy Thumb's Pretty Songbook, volumes 1 and 2 the go, Yahweh. My collection to the earlier versions have a tareko, Baba Black Sheep, Hickory Dickory Dock, the London Bridge is Falling Down, Amasung Sing a Song of Sixpence. First children's books had to be A Little Pretty Pocket Book by John Newbery. The innovative manner in which Newbery designed book, teaching alphabets with rhymes and pictures, considered to be critical in development of children's literature. Teaching alphabets with rhymes and pictures considered to be critical in development of children's literature. Masigi John Newbery irakose ko mana design toramba lyrics se man alphabets kumba considered to be critical in development of children's literature ko mana alphabets kumba tapo ko pada mana design to ko yam critical win lawe ko Newbery Medal presented each year to an outstanding work of American literature for children. Ona magi maming dagi lauraga Newbery Medals as a khudingi angang singki ko American literature for children the phadi phasai phadi phain kan balai to the or author to the higher ko pire. His most famous work is The History of Little Goody Two Shoes, believed to be the first children's novel. Ona magi phadi maming chapa work se kari no higher kadi The History of Little Goody Two Shoes ko. Aduna sina ahanba akoigi children's novel name lawe. The juvenilia or literary work created by an author when she or he is very young. Juvenilia is the habakanda author amana yamna naha oring it ko ngang oring it haragene ko when the create of your works in jibu koiki literary works on juvenilia ko ko. Example in Harvard, for instance, stories and poems which Jane Austen wrote when she was a young girl were published later as juvenilia, comprised of several notebooks. Ona stories amasung poems Jane Austen ko Pride and Prejudice ki ko mana ngang yam oine da I ki basing se ko na mana anora kan publish to gi ko matu The Grimm brothers published book for children called Grimm's Fairy Tales in 1812 the one published the first edition contained 86 stories and 7th edition in 1857 had 210 fairy tales. Hans Christian Andersen was gathering fairy tales to be written and published in 1835. Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales collect published in 1835. In 1845, his fairy tales for children began to be translated and published in English and became popular with foreign readers. Hans Christian Andersen was a Englishman na teko 19th century saw quite a large number of books being written for children that was meant primarily for their entertainment, such as Randolph Caldecott, The Babes in the Woods. On 19th century na kari ugi haba kanda like mayama pongpam ui ngang sigidamot ko mo enjoy togno ko na example in Harvard Randolph Caldecott ki The Babes in the Wood. Randolph Caldecott has the distinction of having created the first picture book for children. Ona magi distinction yamna unique web kari no haba kanda ahanba angang sigidamot focus to picture book to mana kai tare create to gidune yada ko matu na magi contribution haba tare ko children's literature. Matangi starting Mexico. Children's literature became popular through ages till finally in first 2 decades of 20th century, color illustrated books began to be mass produced. So now children's literature is popular okalapa hele ko aduga moise first 2 decades of the 20th century harakati 1910 1900 1910 1920s harage ko color illustrated books in mass produced over hai badi pak sanai tare ko nan to bore. This brief history has given us a glimpse of how changes in society and economy, as well as thinking, led to changes in the manners in which books were written. Masida akhoi 20th and 21st century to ko society da ahong kari lakpudagi economy da ahong balakpo ko society amasung economy da ahong balakpudagi thinking wakalong du ahong balakpudagi ko ana like thing je kamaina publish to ba Fongba ko the Canada ko the 20th century saw 2 world wars and the world wars in the first world war 1914 to 1918 second world war 1939 to 1945 children's books written between 2 world wars dealt with themes related to ideals spirit of pioneers and a good example of the spirit of pioneers is Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House series based on her childhood and teenage years in American Midwest. So now children's ki like lan ani tu gi marata I ba like singse kari themes relate to have kind of spirit of pioneers kumbada ka anu ba pioneers hai kadi the creationists ka ko creators anu ba lambi anu ba semba ko jaga anu ba settle to the pioneers kai ko na say example am pio haragana Laura Ingalls Wilder's ki Little House ki magi series ko or the magi se example the first of the books Little House in the Big Woods was published in 1932 na Little House in the Big Woods hari ba Laura Ingalls Wilder ki like sa yana na 1932 to publish so ki ba ko masi gi se ko ki 20th century ta do ki mati popular oi ki to ki myang pam na ki In 1960s 70s realism made entry into children's literature on a realistic way wari makai gu mako madumba thenaba hore koina children's literature similarly in literature as in life realism concerned with how society economy and culture influenced and affected not only the arts but literature on a real society have a society na economy na culture na kamaina literature bu effect okay impact okay have matang the irapuduneba all this had indeed happened in the early 19th century, but this artistic phenomenon was to affect and influence literature and art in the 20th century as well. Masigi is the 19th century to hogre, got masigi impact se with uwa hungre ko. Adubu 20th century aduki matik chong uwa hungni. In France, it was to gather momentum in second half of the 19th century, and the propagators were against artificial world created by classical age as well as romantic age. So, nasigi realism jinako classical age amasung romantic age ki against the tholakpa wave amne lo. Their subject matter was the middle class, not the low class or the high class, but the middle class. Even the lower classes of society, the problems they faced, faced away customs. The ordinary humble people as opposed to elite and aristocracy who were themes of earlier works of art. Mamang 1960s 19th century mamang da haibtare akhoi wari singumba aduga ketogumba akhoi work of arts kumbaje akhoi elite amasung aristocrats singna moina theme oyo ko madu oyo to toga akhoi middle amasung even the lower classes ko moina mu moiki punsi wari haibtare moina thinari struggles challenges myam gi matang da ko iba hore aduna akwai children literature da ju yapsulakpa hore ko ona mogi daily struggle haiba tare moina no moda thinari ba awaba adu me anduna wari ki kai tare wari du na ore hab tare ya tare adu By 1960s and 70s, realism made foray into children's literature with realistic stories about issues such as abandonment, death, obesity. Una realistic oiba themes haiba tare ko akoina everyday life ta thiknaba akoina akoi real life ta thiknaba themes myam da focus over themes in children's literature yoksar punga me hana di akoi gi fantasy gumba ko akoi mam haiba fairy tales gumba folk tales gumba fantastical stories in na children's literature gi theme orami adubu 1960s 1970s or pakanda di yamna pressing oiba issue ko yamna realistic oiba issue abandonment gumboiro death gumboiro obesity gumboiro adugumba da works include titles such as The Mouse and the Motorcycle, Runaway Ralph, Are You There God, It's Me Margaret, My Darling, My Hamburger, and The Undertaker's Gone Banana. Sugumba lai myam chine ko yamna realistic oiba realism da based over lai ngakta ne ham. These authors were pioneers in their own way. For authors such as Amy Kerr, Cynthia Voigt, and Robert Cormier, who wrote about other important issues such as homelessness, which was a real problem amongst teen runaways. Teen runaways are the teenagers in mayum thado ko maram yamam lay ko maybe because my parents in the much abuse to be ba the much dream mama chase to gida mo mayum thado chela ko me ale ko homelessness yamna common issue mo dida ko madudaga basis ta madugi basis e bijak about race ko race to America to get the black and the whites ko and sexuality maduju explore to ko M.E. Kerr wrote books such as Dark Intruder and Gentle Hands, amongst others. On M.E. Kerr na kay like Ikabukana Dark Intruder, among Gentle Hands. Cynthia Voigt wrote The Tillerman Cycle, including works such as Homecoming, Dicey's Song, A Solitary Blue. Kasi miyam din na Cynthia Voigt ni bulay miyam din. Madunit. Genres of children's literature. Genres are the category it means a full-length story published as a book in comic strip format. It has been subjected to a lot of debate. Art Spiegelman calls it a big comic book that needed a bookmark. Graphic novel Some others felt that the term graphic novel was more of a marketing strategy to ensure that adult readers were not perceived as juvenile or subliterate for reading comics. Oh no, comics graphic novel graphic novel a full-length story published as a book in comic strip format. Full-length story comic strip format comic strip format published debate put Art Spiegelman mouse influential graphic novel even Padu Naman High, graphic novels a big comic book that needed a bookmark. Have this Sangman Banina comic book Aragati, Noju Pari, Akuju Pariko. Yamna Paba, Habitat, Basis Kisiam Yam Daba, direct to picture book Habitat, book comic book high, the book graphic novel the Sang Banina. I am Tagan Manina boy, I don't tie basis 200, 250, 300 even to the hand was on the Art Spiegelman Masana Haibako. Comic book as a woman that needed a bookmark amata kata habadi amutang pamaga pabada graphic novel evolution by was kakam gandeva habadi subject matter heavy oiba parido sangba to some others felt that the term graphic novel was more of a marketing strategy and a marketing strategy in a low karigino habakanda to ensure that adult readers were not perceived as juvenile or subliterate for reading comics. So now, ꯑꯍꯟꯁꯤꯡꯅ ꯀꯣꯃꯤꯛ ꯄꯥꯔꯒꯗꯤ ꯃꯤꯌꯥꯝꯒꯤ ꯀꯔꯦꯝꯅꯐꯝ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯇꯥꯔꯦꯀꯣ ꯃꯣꯏꯁꯦ ꯑꯉꯥꯡ ꯃꯆꯥ ꯇꯥꯏꯗ ꯀꯥꯏ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯣꯀꯣ ꯃꯗꯨ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯛꯇꯅꯕ ꯍꯥꯏꯅ ꯃꯣꯏꯅ ꯇꯔꯝ ꯑꯃ ꯊꯣꯟꯖꯤꯟꯕꯅꯤ ꯀꯣꯃꯤꯛꯇꯤ ꯀꯣꯃꯤꯛꯅꯤ ꯕꯠ ꯒ꯭ꯔꯥꯐꯤꯛ ꯅꯣꯚꯦꯜ ꯍꯥꯏꯅ ꯀꯧꯕꯤꯕ ꯋꯥꯅꯤ ꯃꯣꯏꯁꯦ ꯀꯩ ꯍꯥꯏꯇꯥꯔꯦ ꯃꯤꯅ ꯂꯛꯅꯔꯛꯇꯅꯕ ꯀꯣ ꯑꯗꯨꯗꯩꯗꯤ ꯃꯣꯏꯁꯦ ꯁꯕ ꯂꯤꯇꯔꯦꯠ ꯑꯣꯏ ꯀꯣꯃꯤꯛ ꯄꯥꯕꯅꯤꯅ ꯃꯣꯏꯁꯦ ꯀ꯭ꯂꯥꯁꯤꯛꯁꯀꯨꯝꯕ ꯑꯗꯩꯗꯤ ꯏꯝꯄꯣꯔꯇꯦꯟ ꯑꯣꯏꯕ ꯋꯔꯛꯁ ꯄꯥꯕꯒꯤ ꯃꯍꯨꯠꯇ ꯀꯣꯃꯤꯛ ꯄꯥꯏ ꯀꯥꯏꯗꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯛꯇꯅꯕ ꯍꯥꯏꯅ ꯃꯣꯏꯅ ꯒ꯭ꯔꯥꯐꯤꯛ ꯅꯣꯚꯦꯜ ꯊꯣꯟꯕꯅꯦꯅ ꯈꯔꯅ ꯂꯧꯋꯦ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯀꯣ ꯑꯗꯨꯒꯤ ꯀ꯭ꯔꯤꯇꯤꯛꯁ ꯈꯔꯅ ꯑꯗꯨꯃꯥꯏꯅ ꯍꯥꯏ Graphic novels serve very useful purpose, ko yam important purpose among serve to be because of manner in which they are designed. Command same manner the reluctant readers quite comfortable reading them. Now text and uragadi ko kun sum yeng the satra sing boiro or readers sing boiro text and we panning the book I be yam boring sui ko like have you graphic novel the artwork yawuni na moina pawa kanda smooth heli amasum and interesting heli what do you want it their fast pace and correlation between word and picture na word ka picture ga animak to uhan bado ko word na tab novel kitab ta hui word na taba makes it easy for reading and for expanding vocabulary improve to yam na kane ade pa bu yan wai but most importantly graphic novels are more engaging than other books and they impact visual literary skills of children positively na visual side to impact to na ko koi ki sam na ha ba paraga text ng uraga text ng jabrang paraga pi loi na taba ko moi thi visual gi side ma lai ai pa yaw ni na maduna chu angang sing gi mind je can stimulate to ui ko First novels are narrative poems of long length that tell popular and simple story for children. Examples are Roots and Blues by Arnold Adolph, Easy Klein Has Butterflies by Beth Ann, and Love That Dog by Sharon Creech, to name just a few. Moina prose not about verse, citing the verse novels. Narrative poems ni moina wari do kaya tare popular way simple story diya ko moina realistic fiction appears like real life has characters dealing with real life problems and a plot that takes place in present time. On a realistic fiction, they always say, "Akwai real life to ko, akwai na kaya tare ni yaman na dum punsi da ting na ko to ko, hai badi yam kisu nang niya with hai badi or the characters dealing with real life problems ko hai badi some problem real life ko hai badi some na badi shawat ba example in hai badi ko the mi yama han ba khangna ko da mo nervousness ko ba kai all these are real life problems ko and a plot that takes place in present time. Plot to happy fantastical or medieval real time present time. While the situations are true or could be true, main characters are of course fictional main characters in a fictional way. Some popular examples of verse novel 13 Reasons Why young adult kid novels in the by J. Asher, The Fault in Our Stars by John Green, young adult category. The Head You Give by Angie Thomas, to name a few. And these are all young adult novels. But the children, the chocolate. Like realistic fiction, contemporary novels too create imaginary characters and situations that depict our world and society, while focusing on themes of growing up and confronting personal and social problems. This genre portrays characters coming to understand themselves and others. Life of Pi by Jan Martel, The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt, To All the Boys I Have Loved Before by Jenny Han Kosina. Contemporary novels kumani kosina. Fantasy novels may be described as a genre of speculative fiction that is often set in a fictional universe. Sina fantasy novels in a genre ni speculative haibadi sajanba sagatba haiba tare ko bakna sagatba haiba tare fictional universe of the set to haibadi earth na to to universe of the to world of the set to its origins lie in the oral tradition which is transformed into fantasy literature and drama with dragons uma kai ngo yar ba haibadi oral tradition na wai diram badaki kona moina mo fantasy literature musum drama thro bane since 20th century it has expanded to include other media such as film television, graphic novels, manga, and video games. Oh, no, fantasy novels in the form of film, television, television, example, in Game of Thrones, film, Dragonheart, Aragon, graphic novels, the manga, Japanese art style comic book with manga, and video games. Video games, Dark Souls, Elden Ring, Demon Souls, fantasy. Some popular fantasy novels include The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. So, Chronicles of Narnia later C.S. Lewis ni The Voice of the Dawn trailer kind of prequel sequel young adult fiction YA. Basically, fiction written for young people between ages of 13 and 19 or even 21. I am 13 to 19. Teenage matam haiba tare ko. Mogi marakta leba ngang singna or mi singna paning na ko or 21 ko mix up to. Many young adult novels feature coming of age stories such as The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. She is a young adult novel coming of age story. Haibati developmental youth amadagi adult story coming of age stories. Young adult fiction deals with themes of adolescents coming to terms with themselves, accept their friendships, friendship, create destroy friendships, sexual interests, desires, discover learning to take responsibility for their actions, mistake, own up friendship, getting into trouble, self-identity, and sometimes even life and death situation. The book we have a young adult example, example, the Divergent trilogy, Divergent Elysian movies, or Stephanie Meyer's The Twilight series. Have you trailer release Mockingbird. Mockingbird have Hunger Games, sorry, the Hunger Games. Sunrise on the Reaping have a trailer young adult example the Maze Runner kind of these are all young adult novels. 13 19 or even 21 age group na novels in this unit, we try to define children's literature. Children's literature, have to define trace the history and development of this genre. Look at the various subgenres within children's literature. Children's literature, genre, children's literature, umbrella, and examine representation of gender in children's literature. Gender is represent together. The next unit we will deal with novel Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll, while unit 3 will examine young adult fiction as a genre, and then look at Shyam Selvadurai, Funny Boy in unit 4. So, nasi lecture children's literature have a karino, katay lakibano, kamaina define togani, atuka karam categories the katupi, may andukulin and navanga meko, nasina just introduction lecture niko. Matangi lecture na Through the Looking Glass to Nainaragani, the Funny Boy Matang unit Marini than a just unit 1 ni Alna Nasigi class doubt labor or confusion lady already Matangi lecture doubt the race to she understand the way they have the way and so Masigi objectives seeing a reads to Bungame concepts understand the Bungame, children's treasure and the last of ideology childhood and adolescence service category the young adult realistic fiction, contemporary fiction analyze children's literature socialization of children and adolescents children's literature so that is all for today. See you later. I will see you in the next class.